prices down far more effectively.
As long as suffering of sentient beings remains, I will remain in order to serve.
I imagined God like my grandfather.
In Conversations tonight, my guest has straddled the unlikely worlds of scholarship, philosophy, and politics. A man who would have been king. He served as Indian ambassador to the United States, was the youngest member of the Central Cabinet at 36, and has served in numerous commissions and committees in India and abroad. He's been a long-standing member of Parliament. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Karan Singh. Dr. Karan Singh, you have a wide range of interests, and you might almost have been king. You were Yuvaraj of Kashmir.
Saved from that fate by history.
Do you think that looking back at those initial years of partition and independence, that there were some things that might have been done differently that could have avoided 50 years of crisis in Kashmir?
Well, of course, if there had been some kind of an agreement on Jammu Kashmir before partition, things would have been different, but that would have involved really multiple negotiations with the British and with the future dominions of India and of Pakistan, and statesmanship of a very high order. And I don't think at that time really anybody realized the sort of problems that we would get into.
Do you think some of that might have had to do with the hesitation of the then ruler?
Yes, well, he had, you see, my father had his difficulties. You must remember it was an 80% Muslim state. And therefore, normally, when I'm often asked, I said, why did your father hesitate? I said, would you have preferred him to have acceded to Pakistan without hesitation? And that usually, brings people up short.
You were regent for 18, 20 years.
Yes.
And you've been governor of the state, and you were till recently a member of the Autonomy Commission from which you resigned. Looking at the pattern and cycles of history in the last 5 decades, are you despairing of the future? Is there hope?
Well, I'm by nature an optimist, Rajiv, and therefore I'm always hopeful. However, the positions on Jammu and Kashmir in both countries have become very rigid. And at the present moment, I do not see any meeting ground. Although we have now agreed finally to discuss Jammu and Kashmir with Pakistan, I don't see at the present moment any solution emerging. I had wrote an article a while ago called The Road to Peace, in which I said that perhaps the only way this matter could be solved is if there was a broader confederation between India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and we go the European Union way. Then perhaps at some point in time this issue would lose its edge. But until then, it doesn't seem to me that we are likely to have a breakthrough soon, I'm afraid. I'm very sorry to say that, because for 50 years the whole state has been in turmoil. And the people have suffered a great deal and continue to suffer.
Someone whose sort of heritage as a prince was a Hindu heritage in a Muslim state, you have worked over the decades for interfaith dialogue. You've been a member of the Temple of Understanding in many organizations. How have you responded in recent times to sort of the more assertive form of Hinduism equated with cultural nationalism? And people are beginning to get a little twitchy about this.
Yes, well, this has been a curious development. I think that to some extent it is a reaction to fundamentalist Islam, which really began much before, from West Asia. And there's been this backlash here. Hinduism by nature is pluralistic, and it is not a unidimensional religion. And therefore it is somewhat surprising that there should be such an upsurge of this particular type. However, it seems to me that it is not at all comparable with the sort of fundamentalisms that are developing across the border, which are much more violent and much more, as it were, aggressive.
You were involved in the early years, early stages of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad.
I wasn't really, actually I had nothing to do with the Vishwa Hindu Parishad ever. That's a general misunderstanding. I started an organization called the Virat Hindu Samaj, quite a different organization, which really sought to propagate the Vedantic philosophy, the inclusive Vedantic philosophy. Now I take part in a lot of interfaith conferences, so I needed an organization which would be my base for this. And using that, I have participated in interfaith conferences, and I'm chairman of the Temple of Understanding. And my whole approach has been to try and bridge differences between religions. Even in Kashmir, from childhood we were worshipping at Muslim shrines. And if you remember, when the Hazratwal crisis was at its height, my wife and I were the only two people who went anywhere near there. When Chirare-Sharif burned down, the most sacred shrine in Kashmir, there again we were the only two who went in and offered a chadar and so on. So we had very good relations. We have very good relations with Muslims in Kashmir. But on the Hindu net also, I have always felt that there are certain concepts, universal concepts found in the Vedanta, which do need to be articulated. This generally sort of dismissive attitude towards religion that a lot of our intellectuals have taken over the last 50 years, I think is really a dereliction of duty, because they have not come face to face with the problem. They have not tackled them head on. As a result of which they have left the interpretation of religions to really the most backward looking elements in all the various communities.
For a long time in India, the sort of national cliche was unity and diversity. It was as if suggesting that the ultimate goal of all religions was the same, and we weren't willing enough to recognize diversity and plurality.
Yes, well, it was a bit of a cliche, you're right. It is true, of course, but it needs to be examined. It needs to be discussed. It needs to be sort of reflected upon, and you have to try and carry as vast a number of people, as broad a spectrum as people as possible with you. That's what the interfaith movement is all about.
You've been an educationist, philosopher. What are the mechanisms that we in India could use to begin to bring about this transformation? Obviously, changing the curricula raises a storm.
I know that is the problem. One has to begin with the educational system. But the moment you touch the educational system, then immediately there's a storm, as you say, which I think is. I'm not suggesting that all the suggestions made should have been accepted, but we have to bring in some element of value-based education, shall we say. All the education commissions, Rajiv, from the Sri Prakasha committee all the way down through the Radhakrishnan committee, Kothari committee report, all of them have stressed what they call value-based education, which is a euphemism really for bringing in moral and spiritual values.
You've also sort of more recently been involved with the setting up of a Center for Science, Culture and Consciousness.
Yes. Well, that really is another, you see, my main interests at present are education, the interfaith movement, the environment, for which I have an organization called the People's Commission on Environment and Development, Vedanta, and consciousness, global consciousness. We've not really become global in our attitudes or in our thinking. And that is the great danger, the gap between the emergence of the global society and the non-emergence of global consciousness. So that is where it seems to me that science and spirituality both are beginning at last to converge. Science is also changing. The rigid Newtonian Marxist Descartesian dichotomy is collapsed now with Einstein and quantum mechanics and so on. And you find that more and more, even among physicists and mathematicians, consciousness is becoming the prime factor now, not simply an epiphenomenon. And how does that link with the consciousness which the spiritual traditions have always tried to nurture? Are they the same consciousness? What are their relationships? Can they be brought together in some way? This is a fascinating field. And it seems to me that this is probably the most important single area of endeavor now for the next 50 years.
It's also a time when science, perhaps more dramatically than ever, is confronting ethical questions.
Yes,
human
indeed.
cloning, for example.
Indeed.
Where and how does religion, which has no precedent, no experience of such ethical questions, how does it begin to respond?
Well, you see, the different religions will react in their own way, but I'm really more interested in how the spiritual traditions, not so much the theological traditions, but the spiritual traditions, will be able to cope with these. These are mind-boggling problems, and each religion will approach them separately. But there again, I think that if one takes the basic view of the importance of consciousness, which Patanjali and other great sages have worked out in India, you could perhaps find a key to dealing with these problems. I'm not one of those, mind you, who's claiming that everything can be traced back to the Vedas or that it has the solution to everything. That's not my point. But my point is that we have insights, very deep insights, and not only in the scriptures, in the lives of people who have lived those scriptures, in the lives of people like Sri Ramakrishna or Ramana Maharishi or Sri Aurobindo, in their lives and writings and all. We have contemporary articulations of the spiritual truths, which can be of tremendous importance.
How do you personally feel about human cloning?
Well, it seems to me now that it's going to be inevitable. But it's a very interesting question. If you have a clone, they may look exactly alike, but presumably the Atman will be different. And if the Atman is different, they'll have their own samskaras. So although you might be able to have a mechanical clone, I don't think you'll have the same consciousness in both bodies. I think they'll be inhabited by souls in different stages of evolution. I mean, that's just a...
would you then sort of surrender to the cycles and processes of science and say, well, cloning is inevitable, let's just let it happen?
No, well, not really, but it does seem to me that as long as science is not openly destructive, like for example it is in nuclear explosions and so on, which are nothing but disaster. Genetic engineering could be put to good use for medical purposes and so on. Cloning itself, of course, is very controversial and somewhat still in an embryonic stage, both literally and figuratively. So one would have to wait and see how it develops.
Is there a framework or a simple yardstick that when we're frequently confronted by moral, ethical questions, it could be abortion, for example, is it like to take a human life? When is a fetus?
Yes, I know. These are very vexed questions.
There are very vexed questions which we increasingly confront. Life is more complex than it was perhaps in the time of the Vedas in some ways.
Yes, it certainly is.
What yardsticks, what parameters do you use?
I think ultimately one has to look within and really try and listen ultimately to the inner voice. I don't think there are any rigid parameters one can lay down, except that wherever possible, love, compassion, and understanding have got to be there. If it is a purely exploitative technology based upon cruelty and destruction, then by definition it is undesirable. If on the other hand there is a real quest for healing, for compassion, for example, a lot of the drugs which have saved millions of lives have had unfortunately to go through animal testing. So you could say that all right, it was a necessary evil. So really it's difficult to say, but I think this is the key is how do you feel within yourself with regard to the technology involved and with regard to the totality of circumstances. That is why education is so important, because unless we know something about these technologies, we really can't react in any creative manner.
You mentioned animal testing and the means, if the motive is compassionate and warm and humane, and that is in some ways a very Buddhist concept where the emphasis is on the motives. With someone like Gandhiji, where the means were as important as
Yes.
the ends, we would run into some trouble.
Yes, you would. Sri Aurobindo and Gandhiji differed there. Gandhiji was more involved in the means, and Sri Aurobindo was more interested in the ends. For him, the freedom of the country was the main priority, and he was prepared to use any method for it. Whereas for Gandhiji, it was the other way around.
When would, in sort of Aurobindo's terms, when would violence, for example, be legitimate? When your motives were good?
That again brings us back to the same dilemma of the Gita, where many people think Arjuna was right because he didn't want to fight, he didn't want any violence. And yet the whole thrust of the Gita was really to make him fight. And fighting involves violence of the ultimate order. And with that terrible war, the whole of the Kuru Vamsha was destroyed, the whole of the Yadu Vamsha was destroyed. So in effect, Sri Krishna's advice to Arjuna resulted in total disaster for both those clans. And yet the thrust of the Gita is considered to be one of the great gifts of our civilization.
Wouldn't you say then that the diversity of Hinduism, its very liberality, the fact that it can be open to so many interpretations depending on people's needs and mental dispositions, has sort of blurred the moral lines and the moral fabric of our country? People find legitimacy for anything.
Well, but look at it the other way. The religions which have very clear-cut do's and don'ts, they are the ones that are having the greatest difficulty coming to terms with the new society. You take family planning, for example. There are some religions which are issuing edict after edict against it, when everybody on the world virtually knows that family planning is now an essential. But we are not bound by any such edicts. We can come to our own conclusions. So the very fact that Hinduism is not based upon any one book, any one teacher, or any one point in time gives it a certain resilience, gives it a certain capacity for creative reinterpretation which many other religions don't have. And so to that extent, it could perhaps be one of the most dynamic structures of thought in the 21st century, where all the old certitudes are breaking down. And we do need to readjust and rethink our priorities.
I would suggest that the breakdown of this in Western developed societies has led to a form of neurosis, but in our culture it seems to have led to a form of chaos. So it's a choice between neurosis and chaos.
I hope that isn't the choice, actually. I hope we are able ultimately to come to some kind of a viable philosophy, global philosophy. This is I've been trying to articulate the transition to the global society. I've been talking about these global values, how we should try and incorporate them in our educational curriculum, in our daily lives, how the interfaith movement should move towards that, environmental movement should move towards that, education. All of these strands ultimately converge on the consciousness of the individual in the global society.
You've had this vast reservoir of interest, training, commitment of philosophy and scripture. Do you have a formal practice of your own which embodies and assimilates this?
Well, I do my own. I do my own sort of daily thing. I do my puja and my. I do. Yes, everybody, each one of us, I presume, has worked out some kind of a personal. That's another advantage in Hinduism. We are not obliged to do this or not obliged to do that. It's sort of do-it-yourself kit. You can take those elements that particularly suit your psyche or your phase of development, and then do that. And I do follow some kind of a spiritual path which continues, I notice, to change and develop through the years, perhaps with my own inner development.
In what ways do you feel changed by your practice? Say, 2 decades ago, do you find yourself, I don't know what more, a calmer person, less ambitious?
Yes, I do. I think I'm calmer. Not only calmer, I find myself entirely at home wherever I am. You will recall Jawaharlal Nehru once wrote that he found himself neither at home in the East nor in the West. Mine is the reverse thing. I find myself at home. I travel ends of the earth, lecturing, having conferences and seminars. I'm totally at ease wherever I am. That's one point. Secondly, I think that I'm very much more at peace with myself. I have overcome the sort of more youthful ambitions, as it were, and I'm now much more relaxed. And I think, therefore, more capable of seeing the problems of the country and of humanity in a slightly more mature and detached fashion.
What were some of these youthful ambitions that you feel you've now put
you
aside?
You can't get everything out of me in one interview, Rajiv.
What aspirations then do you now have for yourself?
Actually, my aspirations now do not really revolve around any particular post. They simply revolve around an increasing capacity to articulate, to communicate with people, to be able to participate in this very exciting adventure of the new consciousness, and to be able to, at home and abroad, to become the spokesman of some of these universal values. That's something which I find very satisfying.
Do you, in fact, find that the audience is now more receptive than before?
Yes, definitely. Well, maybe we move only in those audiences which are already receptive. I must point that out. However, I do find that there is now around the world groups of people who are very much on the same wavelength. Very often people I've never met in my life before. In 10 minutes we are on the same wavelength. And it does seem to me that what is happening is that the whole world is being encompassed now by a sort of a network of new points of thinking. The new paradigm is not one searchlight, one strong light like the Holy Roman Empire or the United Nations or the British Empire, but rather a lattice of lights which are slowly encircling the globe. And I like to feel that that is the sort of pattern, the sort of image that would grow, and that this lattice would gradually increase in intensity until it is able to cover the entire world.
Would you then suggest that in this new sort of global consciousness, it would be possible to recommend or suggest a global ethic?
Yes.
The articulation of this has been attempted.
In fact, that is what we are now trying to do. There's a German philosopher called Hans Kung. And in Chicago, when we met for the second World Conference of Religions in 1993, first one being in 1893, where Swami Vivekananda made such an impact, he drafted something called Towards the Global Ethic, in which we all participated. And that has subsequently become a very important document. And the basic teaching of that document is the so-called golden rule. Don't do to others what you wouldn't like them to do to you. In other words, have some understanding and compassion, and look upon others really as a part of yourself. And from that, we've built up a whole structure of global ethics. And I think that I don't want to give the impression that we are in some kind of a moral wasteland. We can abstract. The only thing is, there cannot be rigidities now. We have to leave room for differences of race or religion or caste or creed or sex or sexual preference or whatever. We can't any longer rigidly tie people down. We must open our consciousness rather than close it.
Even though sort of Karl Marx isn't in favor now, the idea that it was economic relations that would dominate our consciousness and dominate our culture, isn't that sort of going to be finally the prevalent ethic?
Well, economic relations will always be important, yes. But I think that shared economism, whether it is of the communist variety or the capitalist variety, by itself is doomed to failure. Because it does not, precisely because it does not take into account these other dimensions of the human person.
We've seen the communist one fail.
The capitalist one, look at what's happening in East Asia now. All the so-called great success stories bankrolled by the IMF and the World Bank have just collapsed like a pack of cards.
So what do you think is,
so therefore
is
we
the
again
new
have
story
to
that will unfold?
we have to now get to some kind of a, if you want to call it, a capitalism with a human face, or if you want to call it a neo-capitalism or a neo-socialism, something which combines the creation and distribution of wealth with a respect for the human personality and for human freedoms. That is what
You've
we have to
been
work
a whole lot of things. You've been a member of the Union Cabinet, you've been a politician, you've been an ambassador, you've served in numerous committees and organizations. If I were to meet you and I didn't know you, which is unlikely, most people will know you, were to meet you and say, Dr. Karan Singh, who are you? What would you say?
I'd say I'm a writer.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.